Okay, it looks like we're good to go. I'd like to call the meeting to order. We are live streaming and we appreciate the technicians making that available, and I'm sure it helps. Pledge of Allegiance, I guess we'll go ahead and it's right there. Let's stand and I'll lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So, Troy, are you online? You can't hear us. Okay, good. Thank you. I just want to make sure you're there. Okay, let's go ahead and have the safety. Thank you. Let's go ahead and have the safety minute. And it's about mosquitoes, isn't it?
Mosquitoes again, yes.
Okay.
Chair, council members, I'm Sheldon Shaw. I'm the Safety and Security Manager for Utah Transit Authority, and I was asked to give the safety message. Appreciate the opportunity. The message we sent out this week was about mosquitoes, and the reason for that is the animal that kills most people in the United States and not United States, around the world, is mosquito, and it's because of the diseases they carry. And we have West Nile right here in Utah. It's over 170,000 people a year killed by mosquitoes. By comparison, sharks kill about 5 or 6 people a year. And so it's a big deal because we've had a really wet spring. And so there's lots of standing water, lots of habitat for mosquitoes. And so what can we do to protect ourselves? Long sleeve shirts, pants, use DEET in your houses. Make sure your windows and doors are closed and your screens are in good working order, and try to prevent yourself from being out at dusk in places where mosquitoes are prevalent. Thanks.
I took your counsel and they still bit through my pants. So, they're pretty healthy mosquitoes. I kind of kidded with him on our meeting on Monday. I just returned from a trip over in Europe, and in Italy I got eaten alive. Not alive, but they do make a dent in your skin. So just forewarning, if any of you are going over there, I'll give you what I did to remedy that. So let's go ahead and move on to public comment. Karen, do you have?
We had 2 public comments that were submitted electronically. Those will be added to the minutes. And then we do have 1 public comment at this time. George Chapman.
Welcome back, George.
Okay. You're going to be talking about advertising today. We've been talking for the last few years at the legislature about it. Unfortunately, UTA does not seem to get it, and they're allowing liquor ads, and I'm old enough not to be afraid of sex, but Boutique has a full busload, bus wrap, the greatest store on earth running through the city, and it just doesn't make sense. People ride buses because we have a beautiful city and they like to look out. Mayor Biskupski, we do have a beautiful city, right? You can't see it with a bus wrap, and that's an issue. We want to encourage bus riders, but you can't do it if you're going to cover up windows so people can't see where they're going. At night, they can't see at all. They can't see where their stop is, so they pull the cord a couple of times so they get the right stop. That's an issue. You want to make it convenient to ride, and the advertising policy of this UTA does not do that. So I'm asking you to look at the other organizations that have a better advertising policy that does not have liquor, does not have tobacco. Even though it might be legal, medical marijuana shouldn't be advertised, vaping shouldn't be advertised. All this stuff that could be a problem, a concern, shouldn't be advertised. The other issue I have is the salaries. You're down 140 in August. You had 2 classes of about 40. You got 15 good, successful people out of them. 15. If you keep that up, you're going to be down over 100 in August. UN comes in August. If you're going to want to make Salt Lake City look bad, that's the way to do it. I encourage you to raise the salaries to over $20 an hour and to stop the split shifts and maybe offer 4-hour days for drivers, because this is ridiculous. Also, you keep pushing, Mayor, the CWC keeps pushing to control Canyon bus service. For 3 years, 5 years, I think, we've been trying to get Canyon bus service on weekends at least, just to get people used to it. but we have no Canyon bus service. We know how much it's going to cost, but nobody's pushing on that, and we should. We have beautiful mountains, and it should be attracting more people, but they don't want to use mass transit because there's no mass transit.
You hear what I
Please
hear,
push mass
right? You
transit.
getting to an end there? I think your time's up.
I'm fine. I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
We do have one more. Claudia Johnson.
I don't know if that's a good thing that you know my name or not, but anyway. Question that I have for you, and this is part of my ignorance, is all of you have positions and you're being paid by whomever, and yet, from what I understand, you're also being reimbursed or paid a stipend or paid a gratuity to be on this committee. And I'd like to know why we're paying 2 times for the bucket here and bucket there, to make a payment. It doesn't seem right. It still comes out of my pocket one way or the other. And again, it's my ignorance here, and I appreciate the fact that I have a chance to say that. Thank you.
As far as I know, that's the only public comment.
Okay, thank you. We're always appreciative, and I didn't mean to cut you off. It's just that buzzer was ringing, and I was like, okay. Let's go ahead and move on to the next item on the agenda, and that's the approval of the March 20th, 2019 Advisory Council meeting. The minutes, if there are any additions, corrections, and now would be the time to bring those forward. Eric, do you have anything?
No, I'll just make a motion to approve the minutes of the March 20th, 2019 Advisory Board.
Okay, a motion's on the table. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion? Call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Troy, I didn't hear you. Did you vote?
I'm an aye.
Okay, thank you. If you're going to be there, I want to make sure you're counted, so thank you. That was unanimous. Thank you. Next, we have a Board of Trustees report. And Carlton, and Beth, come to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, and we excuse our colleague Kent Millington, who's actually out of the country and on some long deserved vacation time and also some
I
work.
think he's in Italy right now, so.
Okay, yeah, so, which is where all good people go, right? We just wanted to go through a couple things briefly, one of which is our some goals of the board, and then we also wanted to touch base on some information that you may have seen recently in the news, and that is the beginning of the discussion of how we might use the second or fourth quarter dollars for transit in Salt Lake County. So if, let's see, I guess we get the clicker here. Maybe. She just was doing a freshman hazing of me there, so.
Who's a freshman?
Yeah, there we go. You want to start there?
Thanks, Carlton. I'm Beth Holbrook, one of the trustees. I represent Davis, Weber, and Boxelder and the agency as a whole. And one of the things that we have been focused on during our new tenure here at UTA is implementing our governance model. As you are aware, our structure has changed, and what we have done to adapt some of those things is to have our weekly meetings public and getting people accustomed to having, both internally and externally, to having those types of meetings where they're talking about the organization in various modes, whether it is talking about budget, talking about the process, or talking about the future needs. We look at our roles as representative of the areas that we were governed, or where the governor put us into place to serve. In addition, we look at this as a whole agency because it's really difficult to manage transit, obviously, if you can't cross the county lines. Our agency reorganization, we still have a couple of things that we are going to be focusing on that are studies that are going to be done later this year. We are going to be, the UDOT UTA study is going to be presented, it'll be completed later on this year and presented to the Transportation Commission, or excuse me, the Transportation Committee as a result of both parties, and whatever that study finds is what will be presented. We also have a URS study, which is the retirement portion of that, and whether or not it's viable to put the retirement from UTA and fold it into the URS model. Those studies will be completed this year, and we will update you when we have more details on that. One of the things that we also like to focus on is making sure that we are focused on having in our public meetings. And as you know, Senate Bill 136 required us to have the any item that was over $200,000 was required to come to the board. And that's what we have been focusing on. And internally and externally, it has been a change for the organization. And what I think it has also done is it's increased the opportunity to have dialogue. The dialogue that allows us to say, okay, I think I understand why we're doing this. Now, can you explain to me what the value is of a particular item? We definitely want to continue to have dialogue. So we are also wanting dialogue from you as an advisory council as well. We feel like that's a really important piece, and hope to hear any feedback that you have. We've definitely worked at strengthening our collaborative stakeholder meetings and engagement in that facet. As you know, we've been doing reach out to our individual COGs and council meetings for whichever areas that we cover. But in addition to that, we are also reaching out and being proactive to the legislature, with our MPOs, and with organizations that are maybe not fully engaged with UTA. So I'll talk about, for instance, with Box Elder, they're doing a study to determine what the amount of traffic is between Cache Valley and going through probably to Ogden, but we're going to find that out. Those are the types of things that we really feel is so valuable to do. In addition, we've been attending city council meetings, and we've also been making sure that there is full outreach. We have typically employees for the UTA that come with us that talk about different things. For instance, we have our planners, we have our operational people come, and they add to the dialogue with our stakeholders. One of the things that I also wanted to talk about that is, I think, of a key importance is we want to make sure that we are being adaptive and understanding of what the needs are of other communities that we serve. We talk about some of the things that we think are going to be key pieces down the road, like the future of Front Runner and other things that have an impact. They don't have the same impact on every community per se, but yet they all have a significant impact. One of the last things I want to talk about, this on mine, but not on this one, I'm just going to talk about it really quick, is the state of good repair. One of the things about state of good repair is obviously, I know that you have seen road studies, and road studies indicate that if you spend $1 just to maintain your road, you're better off than spending $25 at the back end having to replace the entire road. And that's kind of how we're looking at things maintenance-wise and structurally as well. One of the things that was in the news recently is our half grand union work that was done. And that was done in collaboration with UDOT. We had to close 4 South, which is obviously a major thoroughfare in Salt Lake City. It ran right by the mayor's office, by the way, and yet we feel like that collaborative effort was really helpful, getting UDOT to help to say what we are doing as well. We actually came in, I think it's a whole day on ahead of schedule, and we each had an opportunity to, as trustees, we were also out there on the platforms guiding some of the riders to where they needed to go to catch a different train until we got that completed. That was We replaced rail that was 18 years old, and for those of you who work downtown, you might have heard the squeaking occasionally, and that was really a learning process for us because obviously the curves increased the wear and friction in ways that wasn't fully anticipated, and that's why we did this correction at the time, or this replacement. State of good repair is obviously a critical component moving forward. We look at things like our locomotives, our cars that we use on Front Runner, the Comet cars, and of course our buses and our tracks lines as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carlton.
Oops, went too far. Beth spoke about some of these on our local priorities, but we do have a goal to reach out to each of the city councils within the area that we are before. I've met with about a third of the, for example, in Salt Lake County, I've met with about a third of those city councils. We're in the process of setting up additional meetings with the remainders of those. And then we've all three of us have participated with the respective councils of governments and certainly within the MPOs in those discussions. It's been helpful because every community has obviously not unexpectedly different questions, and getting to there, it's been very informative about how we look at going forward. We really are commencing on the future Front Runner now, and we see a lot of effort going in strategically thinking through that and also contemplating what are the next steps as we go forward. We have the initial study, and it's not to detract from anything, and it certainly, we're not prepared at all to build anything at this point. But it also behooves us to think strategically about how we might begin that process and to contemplate and also to outline what those next steps would entail. We're continuing our work in Ogden on the BRT line, and that work seems to be progressing well. The local partners have been great in stepping up in their share of the future or funding, and we're continuing to work with the federal government. I met in May with the assistant administrator for the Federal Transit Administration, and we had a really good dialogue with them, not only on that project, but also on our TOD program, and giving him an update on where we are in that process. And then, of course, in working with you and others on our policies and processes, and as we selected the final 3 sites available by legislation in our TOD process with Clearfield, Ogden, and Salt Lake. And we know that these conversations aren't just a one-time thing, and we anticipate being in front of communities on a regular basis.
One of the things that we've talked about in the meetings that I've certainly had in my areas in terms of city council meetings and presentations with mayors and staff is we talk about our service choices study. And that study, the public portion, the public comment portion of that closed on May 31st. And what we're doing now with all of that information is we're compiling the data in order to maximize and understand what the communities are wanting to see moving forward. So really quickly, a service choices is basically the study on frequency versus coverage. And a lot of times that is an ebb and flow type of discussion. Here in Salt Lake County, that is 60% is based on ridership and or frequency that results from that. So that's, in other words, that's hitting major transit or major transportation corridors already and incorporating our bus service along those routes. 40% of it is coverage. So coverage is a little more determined by, do we want to make sure that an individual who maybe not is on a major transportation corridor has access to public transit for whatever their needs are? That study was done throughout the organization. So just a little, Utah County also has the same percentage structure in 60-40 model. So 60% ridership and 40% coverage. And then Davis, Weber, and Box Elder has it actually reversed, and it's 60% coverage and 40% ridership. And for those of you who know Davis County and Weber County, obviously the Great Salt Lake is kind of an impactor on that, and it makes it a long, skinny, basic area in order to cover. And so that's what we have currently today. And the service choices study is going to allow us to determine much more fine-tuned what we're going to see in the future for bus service and bus coverage. We really wanted to make sure that we were getting input from various communities, from various individuals, and trying to really move the needle a little bit on this understanding. Sometimes it's, you get the question of, is it of value on a policy basis to put your bus out here because we only have an X amount of total dollars to spend? Where does that value go by going not necessarily onto the major transportation corridors? And as soon as that study is completed, we anticipate looking at that, doing the study over the winter, and coming up with some analysis in order to implement it for our August 2020 change day timeframe. Along those lines, those presentations, the public engagement has been a really critical piece. And where I go and when I talk to city councils, I really try to make sure that the council and the mayor both understand that that I am requesting their feedback. I know that Carlton is the same. I think I've done most of Davis County, but I still have Weber County to complete, and we're working through that. And to me, this is just step one. This is how we are going to make sure that we're continuing to have that connectivity with the areas that we serve, in addition to us reporting back to the board and to board staff as to what we are hearing so that we can make responsive decisions.
And we heard some comments in our public comment section, but our employee relations priority as well. And in our goal setting, we've been working with our executive staff to make sure our goals are aligned with their operational goals, and that's been a healthy process, and we've appreciated their collaboration in that regard. We know we have, like many organizations, we have some workforce issues. It's a competitive work environment there. The bulk of our employee force work under a collective bargaining agreement, and that agreement comes up this year, and so we'll begin that process in a few months, and expect a healthy dialogue in that way. And we know we have to be competitive in that environment. We also we believe we're at the end, nearly the end of our recruitment for an executive director, and Steve seems to have these Retire Meyer t-shirts he keeps handing out, and is ready to enjoy full retirement, and we're hopeful that we have an announcement in a couple of weeks on that. And we feel very confident in both the recruiting pool and our ultimate selection in that regard. And the rest of the executive staff continues and has been great collaborators in that effort. Wanted to maybe touch base. Steve and his staff presented to us a couple weeks ago about a proposal for how we might look at our fourth quarter implementation on the transit dollars that will come to UTA beginning in July of this year. And as you know, with sales tax allocations, you really don't get the money for a couple months after that. So we're talking roughly September timeframe where those funds will start coming. And of the 0.25% or 1/4%, 40% will come to UTA. 40% will go to the local governments within Salt Lake County, and then 20% will go to Salt Lake County for projects of regional significance. As we look at and the commitment that we've made and the prior board and others had made, that the largest component of this goes toward service, and primarily bus service in its nature. But we want to talk a little bit about how we're discussing how that proposal would begin. There's two phases really that we're looking at. There's a mobilization phase that covers the period of roughly this year to August of 21. that ties into a major change time frame, and it also realistically is the quickest substantial service could place. As Beth mentioned, we're completing, and I understand we're scheduled in July to hear the outcome of our service choices study. That will certainly guide us as we look at route and plan improvements and how we deploy that. We are at really our limit in our bus facilities, and we currently have a project that has commenced and will hit high gear here behind this building, but a much needed bus maintenance facility that not only will give us better ability for fueling CNG buses, but and maintaining them, but also recharging electric buses. We've taken the delivery of the first buses, and a few more are on the way. But it will, more importantly, add additional capacity. So as we look at service improvements, we actually have a place to maintain those buses, and they're important as we look at the county, Salt Lake County as a whole. Also, it takes a year or so to procure new buses. It also takes a while to hire operators, and so realistically, there is a delay in that time frame. But there's infrastructure that has to be built in addition to the maintenance facility. There's bus support infrastructure for the operators and transition points where routes come together that will be an important piece to that service implementation. We proposed the following allocation. 19% of it initially will go to some service improvements. You could do lengthening of service, extension of hours, even weekend service, because you can use the same buses in those scenarios. They're also in our paratransit capacity that would allow, again, use of current assets in deploying that. A majority would go to these facility improvements that I mentioned. And then one aspect that is unique to Salt Lake County, all of our light rail vehicles and systems are in Salt Lake County. Those light rail vehicles have roughly a 40-year life frame, and they're approaching their half-life. And if you've been on the Blue Line recently, you might have come across a couple that have now been renovated, but more of those need to be renovated. And there wasn't in the prior funding stream a great source of funds to stay current in the renovation of those cars and the rehabilitation. And then ultimately in another 20 years to have a source to be able to replace those vehicles. And so we're proposing roughly about a fourth of these funds going toward the maintenance or state of good repair in our light rail vehicle fleet. By doing the work ourselves, it helps us to more strategically also pull them out of service for a period of time to replace a certain component, let them go back into service, as opposed to sending them off to a third party where you have to release the vehicle for months on end. And we've developed the workforce internally to be able to effectively do that. The second phase, which addresses the actual implementation of the service, would begin in August of 21. And by then, almost 3/4 of it would go toward bus service improvements and expansion. We would continue the light rail tracks, state of good repair in doing that. And then there would be, again, some continued facility improvements that would allow that service to progress. We haven't defined where that service and improvements will go. Again, the study that's being completed will help inform a lot of that. And we know that there are still, even with this additional funding, there's a lot of desires or expectations. I probably is also a fair way to say of where that service ought or should include. This doesn't include the our agreement with Salt Lake City, and which that service begins in August of this year. And but as there's opportunities, there are provisions in that agreement where working with the city, they might shift some of those allocations, and some of the service dollars could augment, again, additional service as well as in Salt Lake, as well as other places in Salt Lake County. I believe that concludes our report, but any questions?
Can we ask questions?
Yeah, please do.
Absolutely.
Do we have any questions that you'd like to address to them? Julie, you good? I have a couple questions, if I could. And you may have answered them and I just missed them, but as you go around to the different city councils and meeting with the mayors and the different organizations, the planning groups, are you seeing any trends, any common thread? You'd mentioned the 60-40 and the 40-60, how it's shifted in the different areas. Is it anything that's jumping out that is clear, just kind of before you get all the data?
Can I
Go ahead.
Let me start. As I met with some of the communities, for example, in Southwest Salt Lake County, and in those contexts, we were also discussing this pilot program that we're looking at in the fall on microtransit, and where the discussion evolved. They clearly wanted more service, but as we showed, for example, where our current routes, fixed routes go, and they said sort of voluntarily, like you could do away with a number of these routes, consolidate them down, and have maybe more frequent service. And they would name a corridor, and usually that corridor, to be honest, tied between two of our systems, say the Red Line and Front Runner. And this is where our density is going to be. So if you're going to have a fixed route bus, maybe transition to here, if you conserve the outlying area with a microtransit solution. And what I'm experiencing is as we work with them and plan with them, it doesn't have to be the way it's always been. If at the end of the day, folks get better served, and maybe even if we're lucky, for the same dollar amount, or roughly the same dollar amount. And so seeing that willingness to be creative about thinking about how their community is served, I haven't seen that, at least not in a lengthier time frame.
So if I can just kind of talk about my experience. So what I've done in my areas specifically is I've talked about a couple of different things, and I've taken mayors, some legislators from both Davis and Weber onto tours of the system, the front runner heading to UVX. So obviously Ogden BRT is really close to hopefully obtaining federal funding. And so they were very anxious to see the system and how it worked. And I would say that if you want to talk about something that kind of they looked at as a bit of a game changer, and it was that BRT system that they saw in UVX. They saw that it was a lot of opportunity to integrate it. It was more defined bus stops, and it was more permanent within the community, I think, is their general take. And then I also talked about microtransit a little bit, and that's exactly what I heard anecdotally from various elected officials, is that I like the idea of it being, if there is a way to be responsive and set up a system that can get them to a transit stop, whether it is in Ogden, whether it's obviously the Ogden front runner, because the BRT as proposed would actually be a stop at the front runner station up in Ogden. But also in addition to others, Roy, Clearfield, so going into Davis County, front runner was obviously a key component, but buses that were also heading downtown, express buses, again, those were the things that people talked about. So they love the microtransit idea, and they wanted to still see, like I said, Davis and Weber, long, skinny geography there, and they liked both of those components. But they thought that the goal of getting people to a transit stop that exists so they can get onto the system was really, really valuable. That, and they had questions about TOD. So that was pretty much what I heard.
So you probably already do this. I trust that you do. Being a mayor of a city and being in a lot of these meetings, when I was first part of UTA as far as on a board or advisor, whatever it was, I did not use transit that much. The awareness that it exists and it's kind of the future and we need to integrate it with how we get around. Every meeting I was in, I would, as the city people are planning the future of our transportation system, it's important that we ask the question, are you using it? Because we can come up with ideas and suggestions, but if we're not actually participating in the use of it, then it's maybe not as insightful as it could be. And so I just encourage you to keep inviting the council and the mayors to get on and participate so they can have that actual real life experience.
I'm similar to Beth. Have invited on June 26th Salt Lake County-based officials to join me in a similar kind of thing. But I've also challenged a few of them to just join me out on the system from time to time. And I had a great conversation. I volunteered for a junior achievement thing a few weeks ago. Very accomplished person in the community. I was talking to her about my job, and she said, I'd like to use the bus, but I don't know how. And I think we have a real learning curve. And to be honest, I've been asking people around here to show me how to use this app or how to get here and how to make connections. While I'd used transit some, I hadn't used it regularly. And there is a learning curve to that. But once you learn it, it's not, it becomes more, it doesn't fit every scenario, but it hits a lot of scenarios. And we've had even discussions with our marketing communications folks about how can we help people be the trainers, really? Because sometimes your friends are your best trainers and help you figure out how to use the system. So we're continuing that dialogue to see if we can make some.
We'll have front runner and tracks down to the airport. I mean, it works well.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
But those are good recommendations.
Thank you, and good questions. We appreciate that.
Any other
Anytime.
comments, or we good? Thank you. Go ahead. You're on.
There you go.
I take the tracks into these meetings all the time, but I get held up by 5-mile-long train cars right here.
Yeah.
Union Pacific is tricky. Yeah, that's a good.
But thank you for waiting for the lights to
Challenging
quit
navigation.
blinking reds before you cross. So
I was on foot.
okay.
Even better.
You don't even want to mess with it.
That's right.
That's right.
Good call.
But thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Steve, you're gonna.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Couple
Yeah.
items to update you
Okay,
on
thank
today. Introduce some new members of our team. First, our attorneys. They'd come up. We have, as you may recall, we have our legal services provided by the AG's office now. And so we have some staff. Mark Burns is our Highway and Utilities Division Director. He's located at the Heber Wells Building downtown, heads up this team. David Wilkins is an assistant AG, as well as Mike Bell. And we're really happy to have them on board and part of our team helping us with our legal work. David and Mike are in our office full time, and it's good to have them on board.
They look excited.
Happy to be here. One thing I'd like to add is that Mike will be providing support to the council. So if you have legal questions that come up regarding your role, responsibilities, duties, Mike will be the primary lawyer that supports that. David provides support to the board of trustees, and so we've separated their functions so that they can operate independently, and if conflicts arise, we can create a conflict wall between the two of them. And then just briefly, my division also represents UDOT and the Department of Public Safety. There are some similarities in the representation of UTA. We have utility regulators as well in our group. Altogether about 20 lawyers, 7 support staff, 3 paralegals. And it's been very fun and enjoyable to work with UTA. It's a very creative, out-of-the-box thinking organization, and I'm just happy to assist you in any way we can.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I really have nothing to add except Mike and I, as Steve said, are here on site. I used to represent the Labor Commission, and UTA is a lot more fast-paced and a lot more varied. And I really enjoy the work and really interfacing with the client out here. They're really good people out here, and it's nice that we can be here to help.
Great. Thanks very much. I'll also add that they have a litigation team that helps us with any of the claims against us for slips, trips, and falls and accidents, things like that.
I can elaborate a little bit on that. So the part of our office, the Attorney General's office that represents state risk management, is handling all UTA's defensive tort claims. They will assign cases based on their ordinary rotation of cases. So UTA will get an opportunity to experience the representation from multiple lawyers in our litigation division. And depending on the complexity of the case, there will be representation from lawyers that have done that type of work. For example, if it's a death case or something like that, then you'll get somebody with some experience in the relevant areas.
So I'd like to ask a question. I know it probably is, I mean, you're getting paid to do this. So anyway, the thought is, based on our legal fees before, now that we come under the umbrella of the auditor or the state attorney general, how do we balance that funding of that? Does it vary? Is there a limit? Is there an appropriation? Is that fair to ask that question? I just.
Sure. Well, they do get paid.
That's good.
Great. And they're paid through the state, but they bill us a rate, an hourly rate. We get a rate for people that are off-site, such as Mark, and then a different hourly rate for the people that are on-site.
So how is that coming in line with maybe what we did in the past?
It's fairly similar.
Good.
We still retain some outside counsel as we did before for specialty type work. I think overall our budgets are pretty close.
Yeah, I think it came up at the board meeting actually last week that the legal budget's running about $300,000 under for the year so far.
And to address the question of rates, we don't set our rates. Those are now set by an internal service fund through state government. So if there's a need to adjust rates, it has to go through an external body. Our top billing rate as of July 1 is $120 an hour. That's for our most experienced lawyers, and it's a discounted rate for lawyers that are in-house because you're covering some of the freight of overhead in terms of office space, computer support.
It's good to know because I was just negotiating with the judge this morning and his rate was higher than that. So
yeah.
I'll go back and tell him, hey, it's okay.
So we do get the same friends and family discount that all the state agencies get.
Any other thoughts? Thank you.
That's also
welcome aboard.
The same rate that UDOT is charged for the services. So you're basically in the same category as the majority of state agencies. Some departments of state government get charged slightly higher and a couple slightly lower, but they're all within the 118 to 126 an hour range.
Good. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So I would also like to introduce our new Chief Service Development Officer. We created that working with the board. We did some reorganization in the agency. Michael Demers joins us from most recently from Missouri DOT, and so he'll be heading up the capital development, planning, as well as the real estate TOD sections of the company.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. As Steve said, I joined most recently from Missouri Department of Transportation, where I was on the executive team for several years, working through a number of transitions, both administrative and external and political. Prior to that, I was at the Arizona Department of Transportation, working on a number of multimodal planning initiatives, including rail planning and connected vehicle initiatives and things of that nature. Prior to that, I was a consultant in New York City at a national engineering firm, and really excited to be here in Utah. It's been great. So
you're not that old. My goodness. Thank you. We've got a lot of experience. That sounds great.
I've moved around a lot, and but I've gotten to know the staff over the last week and a half, and I think it's a really great group here. So just really looking forward to working with you as an advisory board. I know that this body has a lot of interaction with staff and the leadership of UTA and the Board of Trustees as it pertains to service planning, the capital development process, and also real estate and transit-oriented development. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you and exceeding your expectations in those areas.
Welcome.
Thanks, Michael. Last item, just state of good repair projects. Trustee Holbrook mentioned the half-grand union and the Main Street improvements that we completed. If you think work's over downtown, no, we got more. We're working on what's called the Delta interlocking, so it's between Third West and Second West on South Temple. That work starts June 29th through July 7th. So we'll have staff out there working with our riders to help them around that area through that bus bridge and through that construction interruption. But yeah, a good little over a week-long project there. Those are my remarks. Thank you.
Any questions for Steve? Good. Okay. Bob, why don't you go ahead and take a seat? And Troy, I mean, you're the experts here, and I in no way want to condense this in our audit. Give me your name again.
Stephen Rowley.
Rowley, okay. Yeah. They gave me a list of things to highlight. I think the opinion and the findings, if you can just give us kind of the 30,000 foot level. Most of us have been through audits before and realize that as good as you are, it's still the responsibility lies here, and you just check the process and make sure that we're following appropriate procedures. So
certainly, well, I'll give you the really high level, which is there are several opinions that come with any audit report, including compliance, financial statements, internal controls, things of that nature. Most of the reports were unmodified. There was one test on some of the grants where we couldn't find 3 pieces of fully depreciated equipment. So that means they were years and years old. We just couldn't find them. So we had a finding in that area. And Troy, the comptroller, is working on doing an inventory and getting that all up to date sometime before the next audit. That is a very high level. So, Stephen, anything you want to say in addition to that?
Basically, just to reiterate what we discussed at the audit committee meeting the other day, was that the staff here at UTA did a great job at making sure all the information was available to us so that we could properly audit UTA and be able to give the opinions we did give. A lot of people working on this, and it's a huge, complex entity. It looks like numbers on a piece of paper, but there's a lot more detail behind it than I think anybody realizes, and so it's quite a feat to get everything finalized and ready and come out relatively unscathed.
I want you to look at Troy's hair now, and within a year, see if there's any change. I mean, the level of detail that you were sharing with us in the audit committee meeting was, I mean, Carlton and Beth, I don't know about you, but it's overwhelming, the task of what you're trying to do. So any thoughts you want to share?
Audits are part of the government, so we do our best to prepare what we can every year. We've done a lot of improvement, a lot of policy writing over the last few years so that we can better align our activities with policies that we can be guided by. So again, a great year of putting together the financials. It's 100. This CAFR is 20 pages longer than last year's CAFR. It now includes our pension in it. So that'll be one noticeable difference from 2017 as we include our pension document here. But it has all sections of the CAFR that you can have. You can have up to 7. We have all 7. So we look forward to next year's audit. We might be able to drop one of those sections.
Any questions from the advisory council? Anything you'd like to address? Karen?
I was just going to address on page 134 and 135 on the electronic version. Are those the findings that you were talking about, Bob, of the items that could not be found? Is that the same?
Yeah, that's correct.
Now, you may want to highlight that there were other items in previous years that you've actually been able to find, and is that correct? There were like...
So I can speak to that. So the finding is the same as it is in 2018. In 2017, we had 8 items out of 40 that we weren't able to find. We did perform a small inventory when I got here 2 years ago to write off a lot of assets. We still weren't able to go through all of our assets. We have 16,000 assets here at UTA. So we haven't performed that inventory, and that's what our audit finding says in 2017. And our response is we're going to do an inventory at the end of this year. So that inventory still hasn't been performed. And so they did their 2018 audit, and we were unable to find, again, an additional 3 items, which we have written off since then. But we hope this inventory at the end of this year will clear up any of those issues so we have a good understanding of what assets we have out there, where they're at, and how they're being maintained. So.
Okay, that's more information. There's no action needed on that. Appreciate all the work. I was just overwhelmed. I'm glad you're doing it. You must be cut out for that. That's all I got to say. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, next on the agenda, we have a policy consultation. Lisa Bowen, please.
Good afternoon.
Welcome in your new role.
Thank you. My new title is the Risk and Compliance Officer here. It's good to be here. We do have a number of policies to consult with you on. The first is the policy number 1.1, the process for establishing board policies, which is very descriptive. It is the process for establishing or adopting board policies as well as UTA policies. And they are very straightforward. First, the board of directs the executive director to draft a policy for their review, and it's presented to the board of trustees. And then those policies are brought here for consultation with the advisory council. And finally, they go back to the board of trustees for review. So the policies that you're considering here today have gone to the board of trustees, gotten their input. They're here for you today, and then they'll be back before the board of trustees, anticipated on June 19th. As for UTA policies, those are those day-to-day policies that the authority uses to govern the conduct of its employees and to fulfill the board policies. The executive director presents those policies to the board of trustees for review, and they're approved on their consent agenda during a board meeting, or the executive director is instructed to make additional revisions to the policies. So that's the process for both types of policies. Are there any questions on that particular policy?
I think we're good.
All right, we'll move on to the next one then. The next one is ethics. And the purpose of this policy is to identify the standards of conduct for the Board of Trustees as well as the Advisory Council. Ideally, all conflicts of interest will be disclosed before a board or council meeting in the financial disclosure report that you're all required to do on an annual basis. However, the policy does provide for a process for dealing with any conflicts of interest that are disclosed in a meeting. And that gives the council or the board authority to exclude a member from deliberations or from voting, depending on the circumstances. I would like to point out in our policy a conflict of interest includes any investment property that's a half mile from a track station, a front runner station, or from a transit-oriented development project. And that's why we'll ask that information in the financial disclosure report that's filed each year. With respect to the Code of Conduct and Financial Disclosure Report, those are required on an annual basis, and they'll be due on October 31st. So you'll be hearing from our ethics officer, who is also our internal auditor, fairly soon. If there's any conflicts of interest that are identified in that financial disclosure report, the ethics officer will work with the board, the trustee, or the member to resolve that. If the conflict is unresolved at that point, then it's raised to the board chair or the board or the chair of the advisory council. And finally, any conflicts of interest are reported to the appointing jurisdiction. In the event that we get complaints that are ethics complaints that are subject to the Utah Public Officers and Employee Ethics Act, those will be forwarded to the Political Subdivision Ethics Review Commission for investigation and review. If they are not filed under that act, or if they don't meet the standard for that board, then our ethics officer will conduct the investigation, or the investigation will be referred to an independent investigator depending on the circumstances. And then those reports are also given to the board and the chair of the advisory council. So that's our ethics policy. Are there any questions on the ethics policy that I could answer? All right, moving quite quickly then. I'll let Bob discuss our next two policies.
So we had several financial policies in several different places within the organization. I was asked to put together a financial management policy. So just go through that pretty quickly. You want to think about, why do we even have a financial policy? Well, we want to make sure there's financial oversight. We want to make sure we talk about long-term needs. You heard the board members talk about that earlier. that we protect assets in our infrastructure, talked about that earlier too, and then that we develop and implement appropriate internal controls. So that knits all the financial policies together, and that's what we're trying to accomplish when we pull all of these together. There are actually 10 different areas where we set up financial policies. We'll talk a little bit more about reserves, but we have them for grants, investments, debt, financial reporting, risk management, internal and external controls, long-term financial planning, budgeting, and capital. And that was in you should have gotten that financial management policy. I want to go over the reserves one fairly quickly because this is a different allocation than we've had in the past. And I believe you got a spreadsheet that showed hopefully you got a spreadsheet that showed the previous allocation and this proposed allocation. And what this does is it eliminates a couple of the reserves we had before. We had one for parts, we had one for fuel, we had one for risk. So some of that was put into the general operating, moving that from 9 1/3% to 12%. Service stabilization used to be 5%. That was set up about 12 years ago. We've never used it. It's there in case there's a recession to give us time to make decisions about service. So we felt comfortable moving that down to 3%. And then one of the holes that we felt we had in our reserve policies, we didn't really have a capital replacement reserve. So the recommendation is 1% of our fiscal assets based upon audited information. So that's an aspirational goal. That would eventually be $40 million. But initially, we're putting a little bit over $10 million in there. At least that's the recommendation. And that would be for something that, we budgeted, something happens that we didn't budget, we've got money to handle any of those major capital items. The bond reserve is actually per our bond covenants, and we just hold that money to take care of the bondholders. And then we have a debt reduction fund. The board, I guess about 7 years ago, set up this concept that if we do a bond refunding, any savings from that bond refunding would go into this account, which the primary purpose is to reduce debt when we can call bonds, which the first time is 2022, or they could use it for any other purpose, but they have to take action to do that. And so that's the other fund. It'll be $71 million at the end of this year. And so that's a total of $166 million. Now, note the asterisks. As we were looking at these financial policies, we also checked the Government Finance Officers Association best practices and saw to determine if there's anything we should add to some of these policies. And this is an add. It's a new provision that says if you do use any of the funds for service stabilization, capital replacement, or the bonds, you have to create a plan and restore those within 60 months. And so that just requires some financial discipline on the agency. And so there were some new requirements, again, going back to looking at the best practices. There's a new requirement the executive director reports annually to the board on risk management program and how we're doing. On the capital side, there's two. One, that we develop a 5-year capital plan. That's something that this group will be involved in. It's updated yearly, and then it's included in the annual budget discussions. And then setting an expectation that the 5-year capital plan is fiscally constrained and maintains all assets at a state of good repair. And the reasons why we'd want to do that, as was mentioned earlier, it minimizes cost if you do the maintenance on a regular basis. Questions on the financial policies before we move on?
Go ahead, Karen.
I have a question on H2. It talks about doing an annual report to the State Bonding Commission. I am just wondering if it might be a good idea to also do some kind of an annual report to this body as we're trying to help give advice. It would be nice to know what that long-term plan looked like.
Certainly. That is a requirement of Senate Bill 136, and we can do the same here. If there's no additional questions on that, the board members talked a little bit about this already, the contracting authority and procurement. This particular policy, again, is in alignment with some of the actions the board's already taken, but we'll just walk you through it real quickly. First thing it does is delegate some authority. It designates me, the CFO, as the Chief Procurement Officer, so I get to wear that hat. And some of the things I get to do with that is, if there's ever a protest about a procurement, I'm the first person who hears that appeal from the vendor. So I have to distance myself from any procurement. I can't have any say in the selection. So we build up that wall. Then if there's a protest of my decision on that, then it goes to the board for their review. So again, the board has to keep themselves separate from any selection process also. We've had a provision like this about former employees before, and what we had before was sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so if an employee leaves, we can procure from another, from the employee, as long as they meet certain criteria. And those criteria are if it's within the first 6 months, or it's going to be more than 6 months. If it's more than $25,000, it has to get approval from the board. So the executive director can hire a former employee under certain circumstances, but if it's outside of those, it has to go to the board for approval. The second one is an addition, really, which is if an employee goes to a different firm that's doing business with us, we have to check and make sure there's not a conflict of interest there. Typically, what will happen, most vendors will put that person in an area that doesn't do business with us for a while, just to avoid that conflict of interest or the appearance of conflict of interest. The next section talks about contracts, change orders, disbursements. According to state law, the board approves all contracts and disbursements over $200,000. If there's a change order, the board approves it if it's more than 15% or over $200,000, as long as the contract in total is over $200,000. Or if the executive director signed a contract that is $190,000 and there's a $15,000 change order, even though it's not 15%, it took it over the $200,000 threshold. That requires board approval too. So essentially, the executive director can approve any contract and change order that, as long as it's under $200,000. Once it goes over that $200,000 threshold, the board's involved in those decisions. On disbursements, the board approves those, but they can, by resolution, and they have said there are certain disbursements over $200,000. We're going to make those. We're going to pay the utility bills. We're going to take money withheld from employees' checks and send it to the IRS in the state of Utah, things like that. And so we have a list of contracts and contractors that the board's approved, knowing that those are in the budget, and essentially they'll say yes to those. And then there's also a provision for an emergency that the executive director could approve something over $200,000 if the agency would sustain serious injury if it's not approved immediately. If the executive director does that, he or she will have to report that at the next scheduled board meeting. So that's the contract authority and procurement policy. Questions on that?
I think you're good.
To me. So the next policy we have for review is the advertising and naming policy. And the purpose of this policy... My kids think I talk too loud, so I just assumed that was the same case here. The purpose of our advertising policy is to make sure that advertising content on buses and vehicles and transit facilities comply with state law. So the list of prohibited content that you see there is based on state law with respect to things like tobacco and nudity, etc. And it also establishes the process by which by which the board approves the naming of stations, facilities, and service brands. And that's pretty much it for that policy. Are there any questions with respect to that? Okay. The next policy is 4.2, public records. This complies with the government records requirements. So any request for a written record or any type of record from the authority must be submitted to our records officer, and that can be a written form or via email. We have an email address that's set up to take those types of requests. If a person requests a record and the records officer denies that request based on state statute, then that person can appeal to the executive director, appeal that decision. And if the executive director continues to deny the request, then that person can appeal to the State Records Committee. And finally, the fees for copies, memory sticks, those kinds of things are established by the Board of Trustees, and they're also available on the website. Questions on that policy? Real property. Paul Drake is going to discuss that one.
Hello, council members. I'm Paul Drake. I'm the Senior Manager of Real Estate and Transit-Oriented Development. Here to talk about the proposed real property policy. The purpose of this policy is to basically guide the real property transactions of the agency. There are two definitions as listed up there on the slide. Approved capital project, that's essentially any capital project that includes a budget for real property and is approved by the Board of Trustees. The other is a real property transaction that includes acquisitions, dispositions, encumbrances, other commitments, contracts related to real property. The policy would require board approval if any of the following are true. The transaction amount is greater than $200,000, except of course if it's part of an approved capital project. The transaction exceeds the property line item in the approved capital project budget. The transaction requires the use of eminent domain. The purchase price exceeds the fair market value plus the FTA approved administrative settlement. The proposed transaction interferes with the intended use of the property, transit operations, or FTA required continuing control. Transaction amount changes after board approval by 15% or more negatively to UTA. Examples of that would be is that if we are purchasing property, it goes up, which is unlikely after we've negotiated a contract. But if we're selling a property and it goes down by 15%, for example, in the case of due diligence and they have found something and that we have to lower the sale price, we would come back to the board for that. And then finally, if the transaction is conveying rights associated with TOD, and that's per state statute. The board action would be documented by resolution in two cases. One is that if it exceeds $1 million, and the other is that if the board wished to set parameters for delegating authority to the executive director and when they approve a capital project. The policy includes three property classifications: transit critical, transit-oriented development, and surplus. The board would approve any reclassifications of property from transit critical to either TOD or surplus, and then transit-oriented development to surplus. Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Should we go right into the revisions to the bylaws?
Don't slow down.
Or do you
Keep
need
it
a
going.
break?
No, I think we're good.
All right. Before we discuss the revisions, I did want to point out that the bylaws currently allow for reimbursement for your attendance here based on a state administrative rule. So any of you who are currently working for cities or other governmental entities, if you're being paid, then you don't get reimbursement for attending a board meeting at UTA. The proposed bylaws make four categories of revisions, and the first category of revisions deals with the name change from the advisory board to the advisory council. So you'll see that reflected in the amended bylaws. The second makes some clarifications with respect to two committees, the Audit Committee and the Pension Committee. With respect to the Audit Committee, the bylaws have been amended to allow, come back, there we go, to allow the Audit Committee to hear both internal and external audits, and also to approve the charter for the internal auditor as well as for the Audit Committee. The second change that's been made is to the Pension Committee. The Pension Committee is not a product of the board. It was not created by the board. It was actually created by the pension document that oversees the pension plan. So accordingly, the duties for oversight have been transferred to the board chair to administer the pension and the Pension Committee. The third change that was made for officers is to allow officers to temporarily delegate their responsibilities for short-term absences to another trustee or member. And it also authorizes the Advisory Council Chair to serve 2 consecutive one-year terms. And finally, it clarifies that reimbursement for expenses for mileage will be made at the IRS rate, and for meals will be made at the state rate, which I believe right now is $10 for breakfast, $14 for lunch, and $19 for dinner. So those are the proposed changes to the bylaws. Do you have any questions on those?
I don't think so. We're good.
Perfect. As far as next step goes, at the June 19th Board of Trustees meeting, they will be considering these policies and also the amended bylaws for adoption. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Bob, I guess you get to stay, right?
That's right.
All right. So budget consultation. Okay.
Certainly, there's 2 items here. One's the budget process overview, and then we'll talk about the budget amendment that the board looked at these both, I believe, recently. Budget process in May, amended budget earlier this month. So talk about the budget process overview. You've seen process maps like this before. We thought we should put those together for the budget. Start first with capital budget, and that is hard to read, isn't it, on that screen. So the green boxes are staff work. The orange kind of boxes are board work. I see we've got one box that should be green. Departments prepare initial request on the second tier. And then the blue is the work that the advisory council gets to do. So just walk through this. Departments prepare the requests on the 5-year, on the capital budget. The chief officers in the organization review those. They decide if it's worth moving forward, if they're recommending the project. Then it goes forward for all the executives to review. If we concur it should be included in a capital plan, a request list, then we'll add it to that list and we'll prepare the fuller explanation of that particular capital project. And so that develops the 5-year capital plan. From there, at least the draft one, from there it comes to the advisory council where you get to review that 5-year capital plan, ask any questions that you feel like you need to ask, provide any advice, your jobs as far as the advisory council. And then you provide recommendations to the board, and the board would look at that and then decide whether they want to approve that 5-year capital plan. From that, we would take the first year of the capital plan and include it in the annual budget. So the board would take a look at that in the tentative budget. Then there would be a public comment period, and after we received all of the public comment, we would come to advisory council again, provide that public comment, again seek your advice on any changes that you'd recommend on the final budget. Then we would prepare the final budget and take it to the board for their review and approval. So, excuse me, this we believe follows the requirements of Senate Bill 136 for your involvement in the capital budget process. Now, the second part of that is what happens if there's an amendment. We're going to talk about amendment after this particular item and how that process works. So, a department identifies there needs to be some sort of amendment to a capital budget. We would prepare that capital amendment If it's just a reallocation between two projects, let's say that we had Project A and Project B. Project A didn't need $100,000, but Project B could use it. We're not changing the overall budget or creating a new project. We think that falls within the board's discretion to approve that reallocation. Really what the advisory council would look at is if that budget increased, if our budget right now is $141 million, if that goes up at all, it comes to this advisory council because that's a change in the overall budget. Or if there's a new project that gets added. And again, when we talk about the budget amendment, there's actually 4 new projects that are being added. We think it's appropriate for the advisory council to look at the new projects and to look if the budget is going up at all. If it's just a reallocation between 2 projects, we think that should fall to the board. Comments about the capital budget process? Well, the operating budget follows a very similar path. We have this long-term financial plan called the TFP. That's our internal document that we use to look 25, 30 years in the future to make sure that the decisions we're making today are sustainable in the long term. So internally, we update that, and then we would talk to the board about their priorities. You've heard about service planning and how that's going to inform our budget process. And then we'll provide, as staff, direction to the departments based upon the board priorities, what we see in the long-term financial plan, how much money we have available is the way to think of that, and then what the board's priorities are. After that process takes 6 months or so, the executive director prepares a budget proposal. It goes to the board for them to review. It's the tentative budget. The board receives public comment at that time, which all the public comments here and you have the tentative budget, we think it's the right time to come to the advisory council for consultation. You'll know what the public thinks. You'll have had time to study the tentative budget. And then you'll provide your comments to the board. We'll prepare the final budget, and then it goes to the board for their final approval. And then very similarly on the operating budget amendment process, same thing, the departments identify any change. If it's a reallocation, we're just, an example might be we're moving a headcount from my cost center to someone else's cost center, and it's moving from administration to operating support. That's something that the board could do. It's just a reallocation of the current resources. However, if we're changing the function or the purpose or the total budget's changed, we think that should come to the advisory council for your review and understanding of why that budget had to be increased or why the function's changing. Extreme example, why the function's changing, and we're not proposing this extreme example, please. We decided to take all the money from bus service and put it into rail service. Well, you'd probably want to have some thought on that, and consultation and comment. So that's the process, recommended process on the operating budget amendment. The board looked at these again last month, and we're just moving these forward together today for your review and recommendations.
Any comments, questions? There's no action that needs to be taken. That's just information. So
It's nice to have it clarified in the flow charts. So I don't know. I didn't get the flow charts on my document. So if those could just be forwarded to us, that would
Certainly.
be great.
Certainly have. We need to change the one box and turn it green, and there's one arrow that needs to be changed too, but we'll get those changed and make sure you get those.
Just appreciate all the work you've done on it.
Yeah, we were looking at the budget calendar for this year. The series of events is actually 3 pages long that we have to do. So this is just part of it, the parts that you see, and you'll play a part in.
job security.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's talk about an amended budget. We just talked about the process, so let's talk about what's in the current proposed budget amendment for this year. There's 5 things that we'll talk about. One is Utah County fourth quarter. When we prepared the budget last year, Utah County had not approved their fourth quarter allocation. So we'll be receiving 4 months of revenues this year, and we need to show how those dollars will be used. The second is a TOD manager position. As you know, the station area plans, we've added 3 TODs. We just need to add a staff to help manage those projects as they move forward. We got some grant money on coordinated mobility that wasn't included in the budget came in after we did the budget. On the capital, there's 4 new projects, and then we do our best to estimate at the end of, when we do the budget for 2019, we're trying to estimate how much we will spend of the 2018 capital projects by the end of. We always have a true up early in the year of what we actually spent. And so that's just carrying the money over and making any corrections there. Take a look at it real quickly. This is the Utah County fourth quarter. That proposed amendment represents 4 months of sales tax. It's a little bit over $3 million. The reduction is right now Utah County is paying us for every quarter for support of the UVX system. Well, with this starting in September, we would reduce their operating support by 4 months. So the net revenue increase is $2.2 million. According to the interlocal we have with Utah County, the first draw on that is for debt service. And so this will make the November debt service payment, principal and interest in Utah County. When we get into the 2020 budget, we'll have a full year. Again, we'll be using some of that for debt service, and then some of it will be used for the operating support of the UVX system, and then it will start paying back Utah County some of their third quarter dollars that they've already paid and some of the prior debt service that they've paid. The TOD manager, we have some additional TOD revenue that we're proposing to use for this. We got a little bit over $3 million in a week or 2 ago from the TOD. So we're using some of that again to provide help to work on the station area plans and move those forward. Any TOD site, but especially the service area plans that were just approved. Coordinated mobility, just highlight that this was not in what was presented to the board, so this is a new request. Again, we got additional grant funds, about $320,000 to provide better coordinated mobility within the region. So this is just adding the revenue and the expense. The capital budget amendment, the original budget was a little bit over $141 million, and we're proposing to take that up to $165 million, but there's a couple of different reasons. One, we have 4 new projects, about $3.8 million. I'll go over that in a little bit. We had a change in project estimate. So we had projects that are coming over from 2018, but instead of it costing $1 million for the project, they say, well, now it's $1.1 million. So we wanted to highlight those and say that it's just not a pure carryover. We missed how much we thought we would spend. No, this is an additional spending for those projects. And we've highlighted that in the information you should have received. And then we have just a pure carryover. We missed how much we thought we would spend in 2018 and how much would be carryover to 2019. So of the new projects, the first 3 are really from additional revenues coming in. We were working with Park City on their electric bus project. They asked us to take over that project, and so the funding for that's coming from a grant and from other sources primarily. The ADA bus stop improvements, that's coming from Utah County and a reallocation of CMAQ, thank you. I knew I had the wrong one. Same thing with Vanpool Vineyard expansion. And then the OCS wire survey, we've got a slide that talks about that reallocation of funds a little bit later, I believe. And so here's the changes in the capital carryover amounts. Again, one column shows the change in project estimates. There were 16 of them total. The Sharp Tendick Rail project is the biggest one, and then some others were reductions in the estimates. So I've shown the top 3 there, and then all the other projects, I could think it's 13 of them, was a net reduction of $500,000. Then the carryover amounts, again, I've shown the top 5. The Provo-Orem trip, electric buses on a grant, Ogden BRT design, Delta Interlock we talked about earlier, and then the Sandy parking garage. Those are just moving dollars that were originally budgeted in 2018 into 2019 to complete those projects.
I have a question. Sorry, what is your role in the parking garage?
In the, excuse me, the Sandy parking garage?
Yeah.
That's one of our TOD sites.
It's your parking garage.
It's
shared parking. We're taking our surface lot and turning it into a parking structure to free up some land for the TOD development. So Sandy has reallocated some federal funds towards that, as well as we've taken some funds from a sale of some nearby property, and then the developer will contribute some funds as well.
So who owns the lot, the parking structure?
UTA will own it. Yeah, we'll have an operating agreement with the developer for the parking allocated to the TOD purpose.
Okay.
So getting to this net $100,000 increase, this is some of the reallocations that happened between some projects. The net result was an additional $100,000 expense for the wire survey. So actually $200,000 for that, but the net was a $100,000 increase. So here's the effect on our amended revenues. It actually reduces the UTA funding by $2.2 million in this $23.6 million adjustment. There's additional grants, local partner contributions, some bond proceeds from 2018 being moved forward, reallocated from last year. They weren't used last year, bringing in from some that were intended for 2020. And then we had some leasing that we had done in 2018. That money wasn't all spent in 2018, and so that's just bringing those leasing dollars forward to get to the $165 million. And as far as the expense, here's how it affected the different categories in our budget. The Provo-Orem trip, obviously $8 million, 300, almost 400,000 state of good repair, and 15 million was capital projects. And so the next steps, whatever comments you have about or thoughts you want to pass on to the board, we'd be happy to move those forward to the board. They'll consider this amendment at their June 19th meeting. We do anticipate there'll be some other amendments this year as we look at the Salt Lake County money. Even though we budgeted it this year, we budgeted it as one lump sum, and we think there'll be some reallocation to some of the capital projects that the board talked about earlier. And since that'll increase the capital budget, it'll come to this group for review.
Questions? Okay, thank you, Bob. Are we holding up okay? Go for the finish line here. And not that we're going to put Mary in a stressful situation. You're up next. You have take all the time you need, but all you need, okay?
I'm going to build a little bit on what Bob just presented. If I could figure out what I'm doing here. Okay, so I'm going to give more details on the capital project 5-year plan. Bob put, it was, I think, his first page on his presentation, the flow chart, which showed how the capital projects, how the capital budget gets developed. And
So my whole presentation is on that one page that Bob showed. So capital projects include the list here. So any new construction, like our Depot District Maintenance Facility, any state of good repair projects, like our light rail overhauls or grade crossing projects, our facilities maintenance projects, working on our buildings or maybe parking lot resurfacing, our vehicles, when all the new buses we buy and our service vehicles, information technology projects, safety and security projects such as fencing or police vehicles, and then any large equipment that's over $25,000. They all get included into the capital project budget. So typically every year we do an annual capital budget. This year we are expanding it into a 5-year plan, a 5-year budget to show what we anticipate spending over the next 5 years. And this 5-year forecast, it helps us mitigate the challenges of looking at using a 1-year budget to budget a multi-year project. So this way, when the first year gets approved for, let's say it's a $50 million project and we only want to spend $5 million in the first year, you pretty much know that you're obligating the other $45 million because we would need to finish the project. So we just makes it clearer what the total expense of a project will be and how it'll affect the long-term 5 years. So every year we get submissions from the project managers. And so if they want it in a project for next year, they have to submit that project request. And if they want it in subsequent years, we are trying to get the whole 5 years at a time, a rolling 5 years. But if it's a future year project and they don't get it to us now, as the next year comes, they could submit it for a future year. But we're trying to get any projected projects within the next 5 years each year for our 5-year budget. And then any unforeseen items that don't get included in that budget, they would come for an amendment just as Bob presented today. So the way the process works, all the project managers have to submit their request to their department manager first, and then the department manager would review it and decide whether it was a valid request. And then it gets submitted to my department, the Capital Projects Department. And all the requests include what the scope of the project is, so a description of what the project is, the business need, why we need the project, and then the cost per year. So if it's a multi-year project, we want to see what the cost is each year. And then if it's a future year project, we want to see the cost in the year of expenditure. And what are the potential funding sources? Do they anticipate any grants or any state funding or any partner funds? And also, if it's going to add to the operating cost, we want to know what those additional O&M costs would be. So once we get all those requests, we compile them into a big spreadsheet. We identify within the spreadsheet how much is from these other funding sources and how much is UTA funds. And then we meet as a group, all the department managers, and then prioritize the request. So the prioritization considerations are listed here. We want to assure that we have a safe system. That's always our number one priority. We want to take care of the assets that we have and replace them as needed. And then we want to leverage any grant and partner funds. Well, sometimes funding is very time sensitive, and if we're not going to do it, if a grant is issued and we're not going to be able to do it, we may lose that funding. So we want to consider that too as we're prioritizing. And then projects that would improve our system are also a high priority. So projects that have a lower priority, we may see if we could reduce the scope or if we could move it out to subsequent years. And then once we get to our prioritized list, we submit that 5-year plan to the executive team for their review. So the executive team reviews that 5-year project list. They make revisions as necessary based on our funding limitations and then on our board and agency strategic goals and priorities. The draft 5-year plan, once we then get a fiscally constrained 5-year plan, we would present that to you folks here for your consultation. And then we take it to the UTA board for their review and approval. And then the very first year of that 5-year plan becomes the capital project budget to be incorporated into UTA's annual budget. So where we are right now, we have received all the 5-year requests and we prioritize them. And of course, the requests exceed our available budget projections. So right now, we're going through and we're trying to find if there's any additional funding opportunities. We're trying to see if there's anything what can be reduced again or delayed. And then we're also, so once we get that into a fiscally constrained plan, we will take it to you folks to review for your consultation. So that's all I have. Have any questions? Okay, thank you.
You did well. That was quick. Well, we have Sheldon and I believe Jim. You're batting cleanup.
Right.
Know your audience. No.
Is it clicker? Okay, it looks like I'm up first. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Golden. I'm actually a UDOT employee, so I'm the oddball here. But I have a question just for you folks. How many of you are familiar with what state safety oversight is, or have you heard of it before? Okay, that's why I'm here to provide just a brief explanation of what this is and what my role is. I'll briefly talk about the program, what some of our key program activities are, and just the SSOA, that's the State Safety Oversight Agency requirements, and how we're helping UTA to get certified in that respect. This program was started in 1995 before TRAX was even a part of our vision here. In 1997, the governor assigned UDOT as the SSO agency. So the State Safety Oversight Agency was assigned. We were assigned to do that. I've been in this position now for about 2.5 years. It's been continuous with UDOT since 1997. As part of my requirements, I'm required to provide a report annually to the governor about the safety of the UTA TRAX system, and also a report to the board or to the governing agency of UTA. You'll notice there that we oversee TRAX and the S line. I don't work with Frontrunner or with the bus. We are, as of November of 2017, we were certified under Part 674, which was the new requirement, the new rule that FTA asked us all to be certified by, let's see, this last April, right? This last April. We were actually the third state that was certified. Under that certification, I have to be legally independent of UTA. That's the reason why I'm the UDOT guy and I'm the oddball. Have to maintain that legal independence. The enforcement authority is provided by the legislature. We adopted the accident thresholds that that FTA uses, so the Federal Transit Administration. We adopted their same accident thresholds. There's a training plan for me and for my staff and the consultants that I work with, and we do get involved in some of the capital projects and reviewing design from a safety standpoint. Let's see. I'm waiting for the next one. Just next one, right? Have you got a button you can help me with? I think it's still on. I know what's next.
Really nice slide. Yeah.
There it goes. Okay. Okay. Just some of what I'm responsible for and what I do is mainly just I'm a fly on the wall in a lot of UTA meetings. I also have one meeting that I manage quarterly. I'm the chair of that meeting and invite a lot of the UTA personnel to be there with me. Otherwise, I'm attending a lot of UTA meetings. This kind of leads into the required audits. There is a triennial audit that's required that I lead every 3 years. Although this last year it was postponed a year, just due to the new 674 rule. Oh, there we go. And I'll talk a little bit more about those audits here in a moment. We also do an annual hours of service audit, which is a requirement from a FRA waiver that UTA has, but we do that usually every August. The other role I have is to approve any revisions to the safety plan that UTA might have. We review that. I have a consultant who's very skilled and experienced with that. They help me with that. And we also review the internal audits that UTA conducts each year, and we participate in those. Probably most of my time is with working with the safety department, investigating accidents, incidents, or hazards. As part of the new program, the SMS, the safety management system, we try to be proactive, look for safety issues that we might find, and then make some adjustments before we have issues. And so we look a lot into accidents that we've had to try to find anything that needs to be corrected. And then if we do find some corrective action plans, I help with approving those and seeing those through to completion. So as I mentioned, the hours of service audit, we also have the triennial audit. As of it was February of 2018. The final report was issued last summer. As of now, of the 44 total findings, there are only 13 that remain open. 15 findings were of non-compliance. All those have been resolved. And of the 13 that are remaining, there are a number of those that may go away, may have waivers, or just we're waiting on some time to see if we can get those. But those were findings of compliance with recommendations. So nothing there is safety critical. I've been involved in the meetings with the airport expansion, and also was involved with the S-Line project. So we continue to be involved in that. I mentioned our preparation for an FTA audit. So FTA will be coming this summer in July to audit me, which just by having a partner, UTA into that as well. So just one more audit to deal with, but that will be this later on this summer in late July. For everybody's information, it's kind of weird that they had Part 674 that was approved, and then they went back to Part 673. It kind of happened second, even though it was supposed to be first. But this is for UTA's compliance with their public agency safety plan. We can kill you with acronyms up there if you want to look at all of them, but this is where I would praise UTA for what they have done. They knew this was coming a number of years ago, adapted their plan to kind of fill what's called the PTASP, and we've been reviewing that now for years. We are, as an agency, we're prepared to approve that plan. The only hang up on that right now is with Dave Garris's retirement as the chief safety officer. That position right now is vacant, and because of that, we've just decided to hold off on the approval. The plan is in place. It looks good. Just for visual, they have the four components of the safety management system. As I said, UTA has had this in place probably since 2015. Were you telling me, Sheldon? And it's not required until next summer that we be compliant. So we're well ahead of schedule. So once a chief safety officer is named, then we plan to approve this. If there's any need for any information about that, I can provide you with more information about that rule. But we are very close. We have a workshop in Washington, D.C. coming up in September. My anticipation is that we may be fully compliant by the time we attend that, and probably one of the first states to be that way. And I'll take any questions, or you can wait until Sheldon's done with the fun stuff, and then we can take them together. Okay.
Keep going. Okay, appreciate the opportunity. Sorry about that. There we go. Appreciate the opportunity. This meeting is being held just as it should, right? We started with the safety minute, and we're going to finish with the safety guy. So appreciate that opportunity.
Not mosquitoes, right?
Not mosquitoes.
Not this time.
So I asked to come and be part of this presentation because what Trustee Holbrook said a few minutes ago, that UDOT is a great safety partner. And so I wanted to come up here and echo that Jim Golden, the State Safety Oversight Program, has made UTA a more safe and secure system with the audits that he does and the oversight that they provide. We're a better place for that. Much like the FRA does the same thing over in Warm Springs right now. They're in day 2 of a 3-day audit where they're looking at our operator certification, conductor certification, and efficiency testing program over there. And we'll probably find some ways to improve from the FRA's oversight there this week also. I want to disagree with Jim just a little bit. He said that he doesn't help out with the bus system or the commuter rail system. We hold safety blitzes. He's there for all of those, and it wouldn't matter whether we were doing those in the bus system or the commuter rail system. He's out there with us trying to get the safety message there. Some of the other things we do to try to instill a safety culture, you can see we start meetings off with a safety minute. We have a safety poster. If you walk around the company, different business units, you'll see poster displays with our safety messages there. It's an all hands effort. What you see there on the left is a copy of our safety hazard form. We ask that anybody sees anything, close call, hazard, turn those in so we can address those at the safety committees throughout the company. Next, I want to show a video that UDOT put together, and it was put out for Rail Safety Week last year in September. We'll see if the audio works. So Jim was a big part of putting that together for last year's Rail Safety Week. For this year, Rail Safety Week is a nationwide event that's done by Operation Lifesaver, one of our big safety partners out there. We'll talk about just in a minute. And it was put out social media, both from UDOT and UTA. So it was a collaboration between our two entities, and then also video security here. Lamont in the back had a big part of that. So appreciate everyone's effort. This year's Rail Safety Week is going to be September 23rd through 27th, and UTA and UDOT again will be a big part of that, trying to get the rail safety message out there. Another part of safety and the safety management system is we have to have senior management commitment. And earlier today, I heard Trustee our Chair Christensen talk about how don't enter a grade crossing until the lights and bells are out. And so he hasn't been on board that long, but he's out there singing our message already. That's an Operation Lifesaver tenant. Don't enter the grade crossing until lights and bells are out. And that's because there could be a second train. And those incidents happen every year, and we appreciate that. You can see here I have a picture of my boss, which you should do in the presentation, right? Singing the praises of your boss. One of the ththings that he did
get a better
this last year.
picture, too.
What's that?
You should get a better picture, too.
So as we reorganize, one of the things that he made happen is I report directly to the executive director, which is the way safety reporting relationship should be, and with respect to MAP 21 rulemaking that Jim was talking about. We should have a safety policy, and Steve put one together there, and you can see that was handed out to all employees in our paychecks in the beginning of the year, and it talks about the responsibilities of all of us, whether we are part of management, we're supervisor, or we're all hands. He trumpets the ability for frontline folks to report any close call or hazard they see without disciplinary action taken against them, and he encourages those. And so that was a step forward as far as our company goes in getting safety policy letter out there. And he also, in part of that letter, he took on responsibility of the accountable executive. That's also a tenet in MAP 21 rulemaking, which says that an agency has to appoint somebody who's in charge, the bottom line decision maker for a safety concern or something to do with state of good repair. And so, as you can see, we replaced the half-grand union in the last month, and that's a big deal for our company. There was a lot of money that needed to be placed towards that, and that's because the accountable executive made that happen. Another safety partner we have, besides UDOT, I want to highlight is some of the auditors that we have. And so his team came out and did a triennial audit last year and found a lot of things that UTA could improve upon. We also have ISO auditing that happens each year. And as Jim alluded to, we decided early on that we were going to adopt SMS, and you can see the timeline there. MAP 21 came out in July of 2012 is when President Obama signed that. By June of 2013, we were SMS certified under 18,001 here at UTA, and so we saw the writing on the wall, we got ahead of it, and we made sure that we adopted those tenets. We were recertified again last year for the recertification audit, and then this year we've already been through the surveillance audit for that also, and we maintain all three of those standards, QMS, EMS, and SMS. I alluded to just a second ago about Operation Lifesaver. Probably the biggest safety partner that all the railroads have out there with respect to safety education is Operation Lifesaver. And in front of each of you, you have a keychain that points you to our website, which is oli.org, and also one of the lapel pins. You can see that Steve is wearing one of those, kind of highlights our partnership with Operation Lifesaver. The state of Utah is so on board with Operation Lifesaver that if you have a child that's in driver's ed or grandchild that's in driver's ed, somebody like Jim or I are going to come and give an hour-long presentation about rail safety. And we're going to talk about the things like a second train or stopping distances of trains, other things that make us a unique hazard out there, so that the next generation understands that the dangers trains present to them as they are a pedestrian or they're driving cars. And you can see that the safety department, along with Jim, we own several high schools along the Wasatch Front here that we're out there doing those presentations for those high school students. And those are just a few of the ones that we have here. But Operation Lifesaver Utah has pretty much every high school in the state that's a state-run driver's ed program. We're out there giving that presentation. And I think if we're going to prevent an incident, it's because of the great things that Operation Lifesaver is doing. And then finally, last slide here. I don't like to finish up a presentation or any presentation really with anybody having the understanding that transit is unsafe, because that's not true. Transit is very, very safe. This was a study done by Northwestern University. Over a 10-year period of time, they looked at fatalities per billion miles traveled. And you can see that the safest way to get from point A to point B is the airlines. And that's the big airlines, not the puddle jumpers in Alaska. Those are dangerous. But moving up from there is buses, like the one UTA put out on the road every day. Very, very, very safe. Much safer than, as you can see, driving your car to 7-Eleven. You're much better off in our system. The subway system they talk about there is tracks, light rail systems are included in that category. And the train section there you see are Amtrak and commuter rail front-runner kind of systems. And obviously, the most dangerous way to get around is motorcycles. And so make sure you're using your blinkers and you're double-checking your blind spots there, because we're not seeing motorcycles, unfortunately.
Hello, this is Governor Gary Herbert, reminding you to be safe at railroad crossings by obeying all signs and signals. Trains have the right-of-way, and they cannot stop quickly. Remember, if you see tracks, think train. Brought to you by Operation Lifesaver.
So the governor was a good get for Operation Lifesaver last year. We also got all 3 coaches from the major college football programs. They did commercials for us, and they were on sports radio stations around the state, and we're hoping to do the same this year. And so that's the end of our presentation. Questions for either of us?
I think we're done.
If you're not done, you're finished, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you. Appreciate the start with the safety and end with the safety. That's, as I travel and as I have the opportunity to take mass transit, I I try to seek out the opportunity to talk to the drivers on tracks or front runner, and their greatest concern is just the inconsistency of people not recognizing that moving train or tracks, and they just can't stop quickly. And boy, that's one of my greatest fears, being a driver and having to deal with someone's lack of understanding of that. That's so. Sing it from the housetops. Do everything you can. Appreciate your efforts on that. Okay. Well, we're at the end of a very joyful day here, I guess. I'm getting a smile finally. Everyone else was just kind of, our next meeting is scheduled for July 17th. I know that's been a moving target, but I think that's the one we've landed on, and it seems like the best one to meet everyone's schedule. So plan on that, and then next is a motion to adjourn, whoever wants to do that.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
There's a second. All in favor?
Aye.
We stand adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, Troy. I hope you're still there.
I am.
Oh, you're good. You're a man. Way to go.